Thank you, choir, Lindsay, for the microphone handling there. Very adeptly done. Thank everyone for coming. My wife and I are somewhat surprised and humbled by the size of the turnout here today. As you know, we've been traveling for about a month, and understand everything's been done copacetically and very good in our absence, and that Mr. Kinsella is going to fit right in. You know, I was just thinking today, looking around at all these youngsters. When I was pastor in Tacoma, I was the youngest pastor in the Northwest. We had Dennis Luker in Seattle, north of us. We had Mr. Bob Dick down here. We had Larry Walker in Bend. We had Mark Mickelson, who was 3 years older than me, in Spokane. And we just had Mr. Sephoric down in Salem. So I was sort of the child of the Northwest. And lo and behold, about 7 years later, when I moved down here, I realized I'm the grandpa. That all these older fellas now have been replaced by younger men. We have Mr. Light down in Salem, Mr. Slocum up in the Seattle area, and we have Mr. Laus, who couldn't be here today, in Tacoma, Olympia, and of course we have Mr. Kinsella here, and over in Bend we have Jeff and his wife. So things have really changed, but I'm really thankful. Really appreciate that God has provided solid men to replace the men who have served so faithfully here in the Northwest. And as you know, during the let's just say the big challenges of the past 35 to 40 years, the Northwest has honestly been the most solid part of the Church of God. We have weathered the 1995 crisis, the others that have come through with far less loss of people, far less loss of our teens or our youth. Our camps have been very solid and very instrumental in that, and I really appreciate very much that God has replaced the leadership that has gone into retirement or simply left us. And it's just been a wonderful thing to be able to be a part of that. So I want to just say how much we appreciate very much having been a part of it. Began thinking last year, as you know, Mr. Rick Beam died. Rick was 4 years older than me, and he had been down in the South for all of his ministry. I knew Rick in college because he stayed in Longview and around the Big Sandy area during my first couple of years as an Ambassador College student. But Rick was, his son married my daughter, Bridget, and so he was, obviously, we went down to the wedding, knew Rick very well, and very, very sad loss to lose him, dying of pancreatic cancer. But during the memorial service, which was very large, his brother talked about how Rick had considered himself called by God to sort of keep the southeast United States sort of having at least one person that they knew that didn't move in and out, and he had pastored everything from Texas, Huntsville, Georgia, and had been over even in Paducah, Kentucky, in that area, but kind of in a big circular area around the southeast. And a few people said, well, that's kind of like what you've been, Rex, up in the Northwest, because we have been. Whether God called us for that or not, that's the way it worked out. After I went to Ambassador College in 1972 and graduated in 76, my lovely bride and I moved to Pasco in January of 1977, and of course didn't have a job or anything. We were pounding the streets. Many of you may remember there was a president then named Jimmy Carter, and trying to find a job was extremely difficult. The country was in very high interest rates. It was economic, let's just say, challenged in a way that many of our youngsters today would have no understanding of. And so we walked the streets of the Tri-Cities for 2.5, 3 weeks, ran out of money completely, got down to our last few pennies, didn't have enough for rent. And so if we took off one day, and I told Patty, let's just take off a day and fast and ask God to open a door, because obviously there's no door been open to us to stay here in the Tri-Cities. And at that time, the pastor there had asked me to come because he had started another church and he needed help with sermonettes and just clubs and things. And I was just fresh out of college, 22 years old, so I thought I could be much help. But the day after, we stayed home and fasted. The day after that, we both were hired by the Tri-City Herald newspaper, which I really didn't necessarily enjoy the job. My wife did. She first was kind of just a typist and delivered papers, but some of the businesses in the Tri-Cities called the director of advertising and said, you better hire her as a salesman because she has really got a connection with people. And so within a year, she was the highest selling advertising salesman in the Tri-City Herald, which had a staff of about 12 salespeople. So she became very well known in the Tri-Cities. I, on the other hand, lost my job at the newspaper because I really didn't like it, and they didn't really think my job I was doing was very good. So sometimes things just don't work out. You don't fit in. And so I eventually worked in construction and then became an engineer at Hanford. And then, of course, just to continue sort of the story, in 1979, I was ordained an elder on the Day of Trumpets, and we began, let's just say before that, actually, we began 45 years of doing 2 churches every Sabbath. Getting up early in the morning, sometimes driving 2 hours to up north or somewhere, giving a sermon, and then driving 2 more hours. Well, we used to go from Quincy up to Tonasket, which we did quite often. In fact, we did it 2 days before my son was born, so I'm glad that he wasn't born on the trip. But we would leave during the closing prayer because you couldn't get there to the next church in time unless you did. And so we would go up there and then give another sermon, and then we would have Spokesman's Club, and then we would go to somebody's house and visit for a long time, and then get up at 4 in the morning and go cut firewood to earn money for the church activity fund. And then come back and barely get home at midnight and get up at 4 in the morning, get ready for my job at Hanford again. So I can't do that now. I'm too worn out. One sermon a day, and I'm sort of just needing to go home and sit back with some, warm milk and sort of chill out. Maybe watch something benign on TV that requires no thought. So the years have taken their toll in that sense, but that's the way things go. But we have really enjoyed very much the great blessings we've been given. In 1982, we were sent down to. Well, it's just began a long history of being assigned to churches I never went to. The first phone call I got, it was from Mr. John Anderson. They wanted to hire me to be the assistant up in Tacoma, which I eventually went to 30-some years later. But at any rate, we were in the car just about ready to go, and the phone rings, and they said, "Oh, head south, young man, go down to Salem." And so we headed down to be with Mr. David Mills, the man that I grew to truly admire, love, and respect in a great way. Certainly one of the most converted people and wise men I've ever known. So we worked in Salem for a year, then we were moved down to Albany. That began 13 years of 14 moves. So it was very hard on my wife. People think, is the ministry difficult? Well, the challenge at that time, it's not that bad now, but just keep in mind, all you youngsters, that some of us moved more times than once a year in our tenure with Worldwide. It wasn't always because the church moved. In several cases, we had landlords who didn't pay their mortgage, and then we got kicked out of the house because the eviction people came. We didn't even know about it, or some other issues that came about. But I think about 5 of the moves were from, at that point, what we called headquarters. And whenever I would get a call, we would always say, if it's John Anderson, tell him to hold on a minute, to get on your knees and pray that God would give you the wisdom to handle what this man was going to say, because and then get on the phone and then talk to him after you've prayed a little while. So we did that, and often the assignments we were going to go to, places like Nebraska, Jackson, Mississippi Jackson, Tennessee, wasn't it? Yeah. So we never went there, thankfully. We went places here in the Northwest, which was certainly better for us. So after 4 years in Salem and Albany, we went to Spokane, enjoyed our time there, met a lot of wonderful people, just like we did here. I will say that though Albany was the most fun place we've ever been. They had parties, they had activities, they had fun shows. We had more things going on in Albany in that little church than I've ever seen in any church area. And it was a great time and a wonderful experience for us. But all the church areas have been enjoyable. In 1986, I was actually scheduled to become the pastor in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, and due to some political shenanigans and other things that took place that I don't need to tell you about, because some things that happened in the church were not honorable. They were, let's just say, on the less than honorable side. And I received a call that I was being demoted for no fault of my own and sent to some other place. But after a couple days of discussion, I get this call from Dean May, who had been from Salem for a while back, and I'd known Dean pretty well. And he said, "Hey, Rex, we got an opening in Alaska. Would you like to go to Alaska?" I said, "Well, has anybody there ever read my FIDA form?" It was a form you filled out saying where you wanted to go live. And they said, "No, I guess we haven't." So I said, well, the first state on there I wanted to go to was Alaska. So we went up to Alaska, and it was, in some cases, disappointing, but we learned very quickly that God makes decisions and controls your life, and it turned out to be a great blessing, not only for us and our kids, but also when the church finally fell apart in 1995. I was the one who was fired first one fired in the north. Well, actually, Harold Smith was first. I was second. I was essentially terminated December 31st, 1994, because of this 16-page rebuttal I wrote of a sermon that was given that you could play golf on the Sabbath, and I was very upset about it. That had been, though, going on for about a year and a half. I've been writing rebuttal letters into Pasadena to some men whose names you would know, saying what you're teaching is wrong. Now, you don't know how far back in your life God began to work with you, do you? Was it like Jeremiah before you were born? Or was it maybe when you were 5 years old, like Samuel? You know, you were taken to the priest. I don't know, but my background is I grew up in the Church of Christ with my grandmother, and for all their false doctrine about going to heaven, the immortality of the soul, Trinity, they are very Bible studious. And so we had a lot of Bible classes, and we had a lot of memory classes. We had to memorize parts of the Bible, and a lot of very, very good things about it, by the way. It wasn't at all negative. But when I began to see that the church was teaching what I had grown up with and proven wrong when I was 17, 18, 19 years old, became very clear that if I just wrote to the guys in Pasadena and told them how they were wrong, that they would change, and they would listen to what was right, and before long I could save the church. So shows you how young and foolish you can be when you're in your 30s, thinking you can just write the truth to someone and they will agree with it. So as you know, the years that became there, the 1994, 1995, and some of those years were very difficult. We ended up here in Portland, and it's been a great blessing. And then finally, in 2001, I was sent to Tacoma and Olympia to pastor for the United Church of God. That has just worked out wonderfully. The church more than doubled in size, in fact, almost tripled in size during the 11 years we were up there. And I consider that a great blessing from God. I certainly got to know some wonderful friends and do some wonderful opportunities, which, of course, we have everywhere. I want to go back a little bit now. We just returned from a trip to 3 days, actually 4 days in London, and then about 11 days in Ireland that my daughter arranged for us that we really appreciated very much. What struck me several things, not only I hadn't been there since 1999 as far as a sightseeing trip. So the kind of the display in the Tower of London for the crown jewels, that has changed some. Some other things have changed. The British Museum has been divided in half. The British Museum and then the British Library now are two separate places where when I went there the first couple times, the Gutenberg Bible and all the fabulous treasures of the British Museum Library were part of the same building complex. Now it has changed and we didn't have a chance to get there. We did go up in the London Eye, which is a large Ferris wheel. I believe it is the second largest in the world. These pods you go up in are kind of like glass pods, sort of like little igloo things, and they hold about 20 people. And it was interesting to see the Thames River and the various things in London. It wasn't a hilltop experience, but it was worth going. What I was struck by when I was in London were the number of demonstrations of people waving Palestinian flags and demonstrating not only against Israel and saying Free Palestine, but also a lot against the United States. And I was struck this time with an animus towards America that I have never experienced before traveling abroad, and especially with our British brethren. That really did surprise me. It wasn't just there in Iraq. Now, keep in mind that we were only there a few days, and I think our first day in Ireland is when the bombs were dropped by the B-2 bombers on the nuclear facilities in Iran. So I'm thinking, oh, this is great. Now they're going to start shooting down airliners, and they're going to have all kinds of chaos, and we're going to be over here for a month in Ireland trying to figure out what to do. So thankfully that didn't happen, but I was watching the news carefully every day. I have a couple news apps on my cell phone, and my grandchildren said, all Grandpa does is watch the news. He just watches the news all the Well, there was some truth in that because I was concerned about whether or not we'd make it home and wanted to know, kind of keep up on what was going on over there as far as the reaction would go. We were in a Airbnb in Ireland, not too far from the Cliffs of Moher. You may have heard of the Cliffs of Moher. They're kind of a famous place in Ireland. Now, they're not really that much greater than the cliffs of the Oregon coast. In fact, I've been more impressed with the water. But the Cliffs of Moher were the scene for two movies shot that you might be familiar with. One of them is a Star Wars section where I forget what all happened. It's been so long since I've seen any Star Wars. But all the kids knew the Star Wars scene and where it was filmed on that cliff. And the other was The Princess Bride, which When we were in La Center, my high school kids, they would have all their friends over, and they would watch The Princess Bride, and they knew every line of the entire movie, and they would all sit there and say it out loud. And, I might, you killed my father, now you're going to die. I mean, it just went on and on and on and on for this almost 2-hour movie, and here's 22 high school kids, and they all knew every line of this Princess Bride. Well, the scene where the great big giant guy puts him on his back and he carries him up this cliff, that's on the cliffs of Moher, and you can kind of recognize it if you've seen the movie. Other than that, it wasn't all that great of an experience, except that we stayed in this Airbnb that was a farmhouse. A farmer had made a kind of an addition on his house for an Airbnb. And while most people that we stayed with, most of the Airbnb hosts, and of course we were in several castles that had been made into Airbnbs. I highly recommend that, by the way. It's pretty cool to think you're a medieval knight staying in this Airbnb, this castle. But at any rate, this one farmer that we stayed with near the cliffs of Moher, he really wanted to talk politics. So he came into our little, kind of a small dining room. The 9 of us who traveled together were kind of cramped in there. But he wanted to tell us that they were sick and tired of depending on America, that all the nations of Europe needed to have their own army. And that Europe should just defend itself, and they should just jettison any relationship with us and just form their own army and build their own tanks and all that, and they could defend themselves. They didn't need us. So, this is kind of an interesting observation coming from an Irishman who is obviously thinking in terms of Europe forming its own army in defiance of the United States. But certainly that was, I think, just an interesting thing to think of while we were there, because just right after the bombing of the nuclear sites in Iran, I pulled up a page that listed, I think it was on What Finger News. You can look at all the British newspapers, the front pages of all the there's like, I don't know, 7 or 9 or whatever, these national newspapers in Britain. They go throughout the entire country. There's, they still have newspapers over there. We pretty much don't here. But the headlines were really telling. They would say, Trump starts nuclear World War III, or America wants the world embroiled in war. That was their headlines about us taking out the weapons in Iran. Not one of them said anything about what really happened. They just said, America wants war, Trump declares war on the world, world reaction waiting for nuclear World War III. And so the population are being, I think, schooled in this sort of anti-American sentiment. And I was shocked. I've never seen that before in traveling abroad. I thought it was something that we ought to be aware of, because I do believe that we are on the cusp of some major events in world history. Now, I'm going to do some speculating, okay? I've never done that before. Well, liars won't get in the kingdom, so I shouldn't say that. I have done that before. But let's just look at where we are. I want to go over to Zechariah chapter 13 to begin with. This coming January the 16th, will be the 40th anniversary of the death of Herbert Armstrong. And so we have, as a church, going back that far in our history, can look back on 40 years of what? Essentially being in the wilderness. The church has been scattered. There are converted people in a variety of places. We hope that everybody in our group is, with what we're working towards, but we cannot build a fence around the Spirit of God or where God is working. What we can say by looking at the moonscape that the Church of God has become, and what I'm saying by that is we have no unified body. There is no effective preaching of the gospel that can be looked at as, well, this is really working. Basically, all the smaller groups are in the same sort of facing the same conditions we are, stagnant growth, trying to make little efforts at preaching the gospel, none of which produce much fruit, but all cost quite a bit of effort sometimes. We're all hoping for the best, and I, for one, must confess that for years I have drooled for the time when the church has a powerful voice again, when we once again were blanketing the earth with the truth of God, where we had all the things we used to thank God for, the thousands and thousands of responses and new people. And when I was in Spokane, where Jerry Oliver was, we used to have, Dave Trabig and I would have, 5 to 7 new visit requests almost every week. Most of them were just curious, but often 1 or 2 of them would come each week to church, and I met some interesting people. But the days of all those visit requests coming in and all of the growth and everything in the church have really dwindled away. Instead, what has been happening is that the people that God have been going through a time of testing. The first I want to go to Zechariah chapter 13, and then we will go over to Deuteronomy about the 40 years of testing. So I'm not saying that I'm predicting anything particular is going to happen in January. I just think it's worthwhile that we observe the truth that it has been 40 years since Mr. Armstrong died, and 40 years in the Bible is significant. It's significant in the sense of testing and trial, and perhaps there's something we could learn from it. In Zechariah chapter 13, let's begin in verse 7. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who is my companion. Now this is used, obviously, quoted in two of the Gospels as referring to the death of Jesus Christ, him being smitten and the disciples being scattered. And that is a true and an honest and a correct interpretation of that. However, if you look at the Hebrew words, and you look at some of the commentaries and the let's just say, how they analyze this, it's obvious the word can mean a human. It can mean a human person. It says this verse, this is from, by the way, from Dake's Bible, it says this verse stands wholly unconnected unless we see it in the like of looking back from future glory to the time of his rejections and suffering. However, the Hebrew for fellow is from a primitive root meaning to associate with, a companionship, a comrade, a kindred man, another fellow of the same kind of nature. So he's just simply saying it could refer to a person, and it can refer to God himself or Jesus Christ, our Savior. Matthew Henry says, of the Reformation and the preservation of the chosen remnant, those of them that believed, the Christian church in general, the third part shall be left. But he also says this is referring to in the end time, and he mentions here those whom God sets apart for himself must pass through a time of probation and purification in this world and have their faith tried. So these two commentaries would lend us to think that perhaps there is a very strong application of this chapter to the time in which we live. Let's continue reading. It says, strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. I will turn my hand against the little ones. Well, was God's hand turned against the disciples in 31 AD? Well, they were scattered, they were afraid, but Jesus Christ told them to go out and preach the gospel to the earth, and they established a very solid, powerful church, 3,000 one day, 2,000 the next day. So God's hand was not turned against them at that time, later perhaps with the persecutions and scattering. But it says, it shall come to pass in the land, says the Lord, that 2/3 in it shall be cut off and die. You know, we could speculate that perhaps less than a third of those who were believers in God's church 40 years ago are still here or are in the grave awaiting the resurrection. And we have buried many very faithful and solid people in the past 40 years. Just think of the numbers the past 5 years here in Portland alone, reaching 40. So just a lot of solid people that we miss very much, but we are thankful that we will see them again in the resurrection, providing we make it, of course. So it shall come to pass that 2/3 shall be cut off and die. 1/3 shall be left, and I will bring 1/3 through the fire and refine them as silver is refined and test them as gold is tested. So we have had some testing and some refining going on these past 40 years. There have been heresies, there have been just crazy things going on in society with all sorts of perversions and sinful activities being promoted in our governments and approved of in our courts. So is that the possible application here of Zechariah 13, that God will bring 1/3 through the fire and refine them? It says, they will call on my name and I will answer them, and I will say, this is my people, and each one will say, the Lord is my God. So they come through the fire and they acknowledge that God is their God, that they are his people. And certainly it is an application that would be difficult to squeeze just into 31 AD. Now let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 8. Deuteronomy chapter 8. In this case, we have Moses talking about the purpose of the 40 years that Israel wandered in the wilderness. So we might kind of look at this and identify with ourselves and say, could this possibly apply to us? Deuteronomy chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. Every commandment which I command you today, you must be careful to observe, that you may live and multiply, and go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to your fathers. And you shall remember that the Lord your God led you all the way these 40 years in the wilderness. Notice why? To humble you, to test you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So the purpose of God is to test us, to humble us, to see if we will keep his commandments or not. So he humbled you and allowed you to hunger and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor your fathers knew, that he might make you know that man shall not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. So even in the church of God, sometimes we have to learn lessons, that it is not about us, it is about the God we serve, the Savior we serve, and the kingdom that is coming. Notice it says, your garments didn't wear out on you, nor did your foot swell these 40 years. Of course, that didn't happen to us. That happened back to them. But verse 5, you should know in your heart that as a man chastens his son, so the Lord God chastens you. And if we were honest, we would all admit that we have gone through some chastening, that we have allowed, or God has allowed us to be given trials for having things that challenged us that we never anticipated. Therefore you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God to walk in his ways and fear him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks, of water, of fountains and springs that flow out of valleys and hills. This is a type of the kingdom of God to which we have been promised. And certainly Hebrews 4 is very plain about that. A land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees, pomegranates, of olive oil and honey. You know, one of the striking things about Ireland I had not expected was just how clean. It's very, very green. That's why it's called the Emerald Isle. And there are rock walls everywhere. I don't know how they build all those massive rock fences everywhere. But in all of southern Ireland, and we went all around, we went from the east coast to the west coast and then down around and back up, did not see one piece of litter. It was clean. The houses, the lawns were all perfectly manicured. Most of them were fairly large lots. There weren't the small, narrow houses except in the cities. But not one piece of litter anywhere, no garbage on the streets, very, very clean. And especially the Irish men that we met, whether it was, bus drivers or a taxi driver or somebody you just met on the street, they were all happy. They were kind of jolly. They were just big, bubbly, happy guys. I mean, kind of like, they were all like Berkeley Wise. I mean, he could fit right in over there in Ireland. And so we had I thought that was interesting. Here, these people live a simple life. They don't seem to be greedy. They seem to be happy with the land they have and their sheep and their farms and whatever, and they keep it beautifully. And I thought, wow, this is kind of like what God promised Israel, a land flowing with milk and honey and all the produce they could have. And of course, they were a land that would be very wealthy from an agricultural standpoint. They don't have oil. They don't have big industries like that, although they have a few. But certainly that was just kind of a pleasant surprise, especially after coming from Washington, the land of litter everywhere, it seems like. And other places we've traveled where certainly the people don't take care of the land or pride it like they should. Let's go on down. It says, beware though, verse 10, when you have eaten and are full, when you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given. In other words, be thankful. Be thankful for the awesome blessings that you have. And I would perceive that maybe there has been a little need for some more thankfulness in God's people in the last 40 years for the great blessings we have of truth and of a hope for the future, and not just the physical things, but the spiritual truths that we live for. Then he says, beware, you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments, his judgments, and his statutes, which I command you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built beautiful houses and dwell in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage. And that is a great danger of thinking we did it ourselves and of forgetting God. I will say, too, that it's sort of happening all over in Europe, happening here. Our tour guide that we had in Dublin, Dublin's just a city. There's not much there to see. There's no great, massive crown jewels and other things like London has, no massive palaces. But a lot of interesting things. But our tour guide there, we were touring him, seeing a couple churches, and she gave us kind of a history of the Civil War between Northern and Southern Ireland, 1920 to 1922, and gave us some of the history. And she said, well, it was all basically the Protestants fighting the Catholics. But he said, right, in recent times, the Protestant churches are all empty and the Catholic churches are pretty much empty. So she says, I wonder why they're fighting. Nobody has any religion anymore, so why are they fighting over religion? And so it's just interesting that she's making small talk. I thought, well, she may have said a lot more there than she understands. That the people of Israel have forgotten God, they've believed in themselves, and of course the danger for us is that it doesn't affect us that much. Let's go over to Malachi chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. Malachi chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. This verse about the sons of Levi has always been a little bit of a puzzle to me, because the Levites that say they're Levites, and very likely are, blood lineage-wise, see them sometimes in bigger cities, and so a lot of them, if you've been to Israel or Jerusalem, it doesn't seem like this really applies to them. Malachi chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, Behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Even the messenger of the covenant, in whom you delight, behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. Now we understand that very clearly. Someone will be sent in the spirit and power of Elijah to prepare the way, and then Jesus Christ will come suddenly to his temple. Verse 2, Who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? He is like a refiner's fire, like the launderer's soap. He will sit as a refiner and a purifier of silver. Now, we just read the same concept over in Zechariah, that the people of God will be tried as silver in the fire, gold in a fire. Here's the same thing, but he says he will purify the sons of Levi and purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer to the Lord an offering in righteousness. And a few commentaries say, well, this really doesn't apply to the physical descendants of Levi. It applies to those that 1 Peter says are of the household of God, who are priests and kings, and they are a special people made up of priests and those who will someday be rulers. So if this sons of Levi applies to the people of God today who will be serving as priests in the future, then I think that's a very logical understanding of it. It says that they may offer to the Lord an offering in righteousness. And so this chapter, or this section here, I think might be applicable to God's people being the sons of Levi today, because we are to be a nation of priests, a special holy people to God. And then, of course, there are a lot of other applications too. Now I want to go over to Romans chapter 15. I'm going to go back a little bit. A few people ask about just some historical information maybe that may or may not be of any value. Most of you know I was born in Illinois. My father was in the Air Force. At that time he was a captain, and he was stationed up in North Dakota. He was actually, at that time he was in Montana, Havre, Montana. He was in charge of building a NORAD site. A NORAD was missile and radar installations all across the U.S. and Canada that were built in the 1950s in response to the Cold War. And so I have a letter that he wrote my mother when he found out I was in the world, because she was in Illinois staying with her parents. Didn't want to go up there in the cold north, just a few days away from delivering a baby. And so after about a few months, we moved up to North Dakota, and then about a year later moved to Havre, Montana. And a few months later moved over to Findlay, North Dakota, where my father supervised the building of another NORAD site. And then moved down to Waco, Texas when I was about 2. He went to SAC training for B-47 bombers. My father loved to fly. B-47 bombers, some of you may be familiar with them. They're a German design plane. The Nazis actually designed them. And of course, America got all the Nazi designs and most of their scientists and aircraft engineers after World War II. We stole them, basically kidnapped them out of Russian-occupied Germany, but that's another story. But anyway, it was a swept-wing airplane, carried one 3.5-ton nuclear bomb, and basically had a crew of 3. And so we were down there for about a year and a half. All I remember about West Texas was playing with horny toads. They're a little kind of a frog-like animal type thing. They have little horns, little kind of flexible horns on their heads. Anybody ever play with horny toads but me? Oh, well, good. See, Mr. Kinsella has. He knows what they are. So anyway, after that was over, then there was what was called the SR-71, a real fast hypersonic spy plane that the United States was building. And the original plan was to build about 90 of them. And so my father was chosen to be trained as an SR-71 pilot. And so we were transferred to Lockbourne Air Force Base in Columbus, Ohio for about almost 3 years. That's where the training and mock-up was done for SR-71 pilots. And of course, eventually the satellites were invented, so they only built about 13 SR-71s. And then we transferred down to Savannah, Georgia, where my father was in the SAC base down there, was a squadron commander and had made lieutenant colonel by that time, and was flying basically with formations of planes loaded with nuclear bombs over to the border of Russia. 24 hours a day, we had at least 1/3 of our bomber fleet in the air. The theory was if first strike by the enemy wiped out all of our communications and our bases here, we would still have enough firepower in the air to go ahead and destroy whatever was there in the Soviet Union. And the sad thing was they had actual bombing instructions, and they had to receive 2 separate signals to turn around and come back. The theory was that if the American communications were all destroyed, there wouldn't be any signal to send, so they should just assume the war is on. And I asked my father once, did you ever have a time when that signal didn't come and you thought it might be the end? He said, well, we had backup systems, and one of our radios failed once, but then we did get back a separate signal from somewhere in Europe, so things were all right. But during that time, it was a good time for my brother and I. He was a year and a half, actually 16 months older. So my father was also from Illinois, and you might also know that the town I grew up in was somewhat famous for entertainers. Gene Hackman was from Danville. He was a cameraman for my Aunt Mandy, my father's older sister, for a number of years. And then if you look online, you look for Dick Van Dyke's ancestral home or childhood home. It's on Harrison Street in Danville. And 2 doors down was where my father lived for a couple of years because my grandma had him move into town because Hillary was too far out of town. He was the youngest of 10 kids. And so Mrs. Van Dyke used to pay my dad a nickel to walk Jerry Van Dyke and Dick Van Dyke to their tap dancing lessons every week, and also sometimes back and forth to school. And so my dad hatched this idea when he saw the Van Dykes getting heavily into show business and becoming somewhat popular, especially Dick Van Dyke with the various movies and shows he was in. So my dad hatched this idea that, hey, guess what? I've got 2 sons that should be tap dancers. And so at 3 years old, my brother and I, he was 4, we were enrolled in tap dancing lessons, both in Columbus, Ohio, and then later in Savannah. And I remember my mother was Italian, red-haired. I mean, she was very intense. We had fancy costumes. We had all sorts of various like cowboy outfits. We had these Rio de Janeiro outfits. We had these wooden soldier outfits, and we were constantly practicing and going to dance lessons, and we were on television 4 times in Savannah. And we weren't becoming well known, but you know, for 4, 5, 6-year-old boys, at that time I think we were 6 and 7. We did a lot of little just military concerts, the Officers Club or the Airmen's Club or whatever it was, anywhere around metropolitan Savannah. My mom got us into performing, and my dad thought this would be great. So it might have been great, but wasn't long after that my mother and father started having some serious problems and eventually got divorced in October of 1963. So then we moved back to Illinois, my brother and sister and I, and lived with my grandmother. So my father's roommate, by the way, when he went to the University of Maryland to get his college degree, his roommate was Alexander Haig, who eventually became Secretary of State, and I think he also was a NATO general or something. But I met Alexander Haig when I was 7, came to our house there in Savannah, and came with my dad, and Alexander Haig had gotten the position to be the Army liaison, because Alexander Haig was Army, my dad was Air Force. But my father had gotten appointed to the position of Air Force liaison to the White House, and Haig was Army liaison to the White House. I've actually been to the office in Washington, D.C. that would have been my dad's had the divorce not taken place. So because of the divorce, my father did not take the position in Washington, D.C., but instead went to Plattsburgh, New York, and eventually retired and then moved to Chicago. But having said all of that, then living with my grandmother is where I started attending with her with the Church of Christ. And then, of course, When I was 14, I wrote for my first Plain Truths. When I was 15, I began actually studying some of the booklets and really began studying in earnest at age 17. And eventually decided I couldn't attend the Church of Christ anymore because of their teachings. But by that time, I was a senior in high school and had applied to go to Ambassador College. Knew nothing about the church. So when the minister first came to visit me, I was working as a busboy at the Holiday Inn in Danville wearing purple bell bottoms. Anybody remember bell bottoms? And you had a belt about this big, belt buckle. And it was pretty silly looking now, you think, dressed up like a clown. But anyway, having said all of that you didn't have to hear, I thought you might appreciate a little bit of background. So I did go to Ambassador College in 1972, turned down some other college opportunities, but and certainly never looked back. The years we were at AC were some of the golden years of the college. It was absolutely a fabulous experience, and I've been thankful for it every day. Not only had the dig in Jerusalem, but all sorts of musical groups. We toured the country. We had clubs. We had fancy dances. We had superior teachers. I had some of the best Bible teachers, I think, just in the history of the church during those years we were there. So I just would have given anything if my kids could have gone to Ambassador College like I went to it. Not like it became, but I think it would have made a huge difference in our children had been able to continue. But that didn't happen. However, I did meet the most wonderful girl I've ever known. Her name was Patty Hardiman. She was a farm girl from Washington, had never been on a plane until she flew down to Texas. They got airsick on the plane, I think. But she definitely stole my heart after I spent a few days with her. I knew this is a girl I wanted to spend my life with because she was just so much fun to be around and had so much energy and just really had everything I was looking for. And so we were married after that. Of course, we were married in August 1976. Spent a few more months in Big Sandy, about 4 more months living in a little tiny house that we went and saw back in January. Hadn't been back there since then. But of course, I've given you what happened then when we moved to Pasco and after that. But I would just say that in Romans chapter 15, which I ask you to turn to, in verse 15, Paul says something very interesting here. He says, "Nevertheless, brethren, I have written more boldly to you on some points as reminding you, because of the grace given to me by God, that I might be a minister of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles, ministering the gospel of God, that the offering of the Gentiles might be acceptable, sanctified by the Holy Spirit. Therefore I have reason to glory in Christ Jesus in the things which pertain to God." And that's a lesson we all have to learn, that we glory in the things that God has done to or for us. "I will not dare speak of any of those things which Christ has not accomplished through me." He only spoke of the things that Jesus Christ accomplished through him, not the things that Jesus Christ didn't, which he refers to his past accomplishments as a Pharisee and other things in his past. He says, "In mighty signs and wonders by the power of the Spirit of God, so that from Jerusalem and round about Illyricum I have fully preached the gospel of Christ." And so we started from Jerusalem, went up to Antioch, and then made this circle around Illyricum, which included part of what we call today Turkey, up into the area of Galatia, and then, of course, up into Macedonia. He was in Troas or Troy, as Aaron mentioned, and, of course, then back down through Corinth and Ephesus. So this sort of circle of that part of the world was where God had given him a commission to go. And he says, "I have made it my aim to preach the gospel, not where Christ was named, lest I should build on another's foundation. But it is written, he has sent to whom he has not announced, they shall see. To those who have not heard, they shall understand." So he understood his commission was to go to those who had not had any knowledge of God before, and the Gentiles, and to teach them. He said, "For this reason I have also been much hindered from coming to you." In other words, I had to do this job that God gave me in this area called Illyricum, the area around Asia Minor and Macedonia. Then he says, "But no longer having a place in these parts." So basically he's saying is that job is done. And I don't have to go back to Ephesus, back to Corinth, back to Galatia. He said, "My job is done. Therefore, I have a desire these many years to come to you." So you might say this is sort of a parallel, that when a ministerial job is done and a man has some options, you might say retirement options. I'm kind of exaggerating. I don't think Paul was ever retired, or any minister ever truly is anyway. But I sort of identify with this, that no longer having an assignment to stay in one place, We have a desire to perhaps see some other places, do some other things, and I believe that I have some invitations to go to some international areas. And of course, the biggest job I have right now is simply on the council. Most of you know I'm the deputy chairman, but beyond that, I'm the chairman of the doctrine committee, which is in the past 2 weeks. We have two very large projects we have to work on. We have a council meeting this week and a doctrine committee meeting this week, which surprised me because I didn't think that we would be able to get 5 men together in the middle of July who are not gone somewhere, gone to some summer camp or gone somewhere else. But Mr. Pebworth asked us to get on this latest project as soon as possible and to get it finalized because it's another, basically, a very important teaching that we have that some people are questioning. They need to be brought up to speed. I'm going to go to 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 16. 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 16. You know, we used to get evaluations of our sermons, and we would have our regional pastor, or we would have they would have surveys that were sent in to, in our case, Cincinnati, and they would have, church members would have comments about your pastor's sermons and that sort of thing. And for several years, especially when Mr. Luker was my regional pastor, I would either go see him for lunch. We were only 53 miles apart when I was in Gig Harbor, and we would sit down and talk, and he would come to the part about my sermons, and he would say, "Well, Rex," he said, "you know, you're just so doctrinally oriented. You sort of divide the black and the white and the Bible teachings, but I think some of your people might appreciate, you know, more warm and tender and Christian application and you know, applications of love." I said, "Okay, I'll try." It's not sort of the way I'm oriented as far as speaking presentations go, and maybe I haven't in a few years done sort of that type of a thing. But you know what it says in 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 6? "If you instruct the brethren in these things, you'll be a good minister of Jesus Christ, nourished in the words of faith and of good doctrine, which you have carefully followed." So he's saying basically, Paul's instructions here to Timothy concerned commanding and teaching doctrine and not to get off on other things. 1 Timothy 5 and verse 17 says, "Let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in doctrine." So laboring in doctrine and teaching what the Bible actually says in doctrine is, I think, fairly important. And of course, Paul taught him to be faithful in doctrine. Verse 13. Sometimes there are verses in the Bible that bring back memories. Anybody ever have that experience? I'm sure you have. So my memory of 1 Timothy 4:13 is this. I just had been given the option to resign or get fired on December 31st of 1994, and Vic Cubic called me up because I'd sent this rebuttal I had written of this play golf on the Sabbath sermon to about 30 people, including Mr. Bob Dick, by the way, who at that time was my regional pastor. And so I did send one to Chris Anderson, a good friend of mine in Pasadena, who ended up making 200 photocopies and handing them out to people who were coming into the AM service at the auditorium in Pasadena. So here's got my name on it, 16 pages proving everything that was being taught was wrong. And so no big surprise, but the phone rang about 9 in the morning in Alaska when I was getting ready to, actually we were going to baptize someone that morning before church. So the phone rings, and the other side is Vic Cubic, and he says, "Rex, you've gone too far this time. I can't protect you any longer." So I knew kind of what that meant. And so I said, "Vic," I said, "are they going to change and go back to teaching the truth, or is this evil heresy going to continue?" He said, "It's going to continue. They will not change. I have talked to them. They are on this path. They're not going to change." I said, "Well, I'm going to resign because I cannot support it." And so my wife was across the kitchen counter. She's sitting there, and she's got tears, streaming down her face. And then we talked to Vic for a while. He did agree to try to help us, get some money to move back because we were in the middle of Alaska at the end of the U.S. road. So that was not the middle, it's at the very end. And I had 3 little kids, almost no money, and didn't even own a car. I had a fleet car. I had an old beat-up pickup that we had salvaged out of a field I found out of Spokane. We were pheasant hunting. I found this abandoned pickup. We drug it home in a tow truck and got it working again. Anyway, so Vic did try to help us. And then we talked to Vic for a few minutes. When I hung the phone up, I looked over at my wife, who's across the counter, with tears streaming down her eyes and crying. And I said, Patty, I said, are you mad at me? She said, no. When I agreed to marry you, I knew you would stand up for what was right, no matter what it cost. And she says, God will get us through this. At that time, I didn't know how. At that time, I had no idea. When you were out of that organization, you were ostracized, you were treated poorly, you were, I suppose, considered like you had rabies or something. And so the next few months were very difficult. We had just enough in our severance pay to make it through, and went through some tumultuous years. But the bottom line is, you do what's right because you know it's right, and with faith that God will get you through, and he will. That's just the way it is. For those who have exchanged something else for the truth, you'll lose them both. Just like the Pharisees said, was it what's his name? Ananias or Caiaphas is the one that said, well, if we don't crucify or kill Jesus Christ, then the Romans will come and take away our kingdom and our place, our government. What happened? They had their kingdom and their government taken away. The Romans came and killed them all. And so the same is true. People that have exchanged the paycheck for the truth or exchanged something else, abandoned God's truth for whatever it is, let me promise you that will be taken away because you've lost that plus God's truth. So we've gotten through things. We really appreciate all of that, and it has been. But let me finish the story. So about a week later, I get this phone call from a man I'd never talked to. His name was Dr. Herman Hay. Some of you old-timers might remember him. Kind of a German accent fellow. I think I may have said hi to him once in Pasadena at a refresher program. So the phone rings, and he says, is this Rex Sexton? I said, yes, this is Dr. Herman Hay. I said, oh, Dr. Hay, I've heard about you a lot. I think I might have met you once. To what I owe the honor of this phone call. He said, well, I said, I want you to assure me that you will not join any dissident groups. I've heard that you have resigned. And I said, yes, and my phone has rung off the wall for the last week because ministers all across the country have called and said I did what was right, but they weren't ready to do anything yet. And he said, well, we don't want you to join any dissident group. I said, well, what should I do? He said, well, just wait. I said, Dr. Hay, Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy 4 that no matter what happens, give attention to doctrine and to reading. I said, that's out of style now. Nobody wants me to teach doctrine. I've been getting in trouble for 2 years for teaching prophecy and teaching doctrine. I said, my calling is to teach doctrine. And I said, I'm not going to stop. I said, what are you going to do, Dr. Hay? He said, well, this is word for word. I promised Mr. Armstrong I would stay at my post and protect his people. And the largest number of converted people are still here in worldwide. And I said, Dr. Hay, if this continues, within a few years, there won't be anybody left converted in that group. So you better do something. Well, we're not going to do this. I just want to make sure. Then he hung up the phone. But whenever I read verse 13 here, I remember I quoted this to Dr. Hay when he called me and tried to convince me to basically do nothing, to be quiet and not to, quote, join any dissident groups. And some of you recall those days. Let's go over to Titus chapter 1 and verse 9. Titus chapter 1 and verse 9. It says, hold fast the faithful word which he has been taught. And I truly hope that all of the men in God's ministry and those who have replaced all of us older men over the past years will memorize this as your calling, to hold fast the faithful word as he has been taught, that he may be able, by sound doctrine, both to exhort and convict those who contradict. Because there are many insubordinate, and that still continues today. There are many who want to pick at this doctrine or pick at that teaching or say they disagree with this or that. But our job, our calling from God, is to hold fast the faithful word as we have been taught. And we are going to be held accountable for doing that. And finally, let's go over to 2 John chapter 1, at least finally in this section here, 2 John chapter 1, verse 4. I greatly rejoice that I have found some of your children walking in truth, as we receive from commandment from the Father. So it is a joyful thing for any pastor, any minister, to have people in his congregation who are walking according to truth and are living all they can to obey God and live his way of life and prepare for his kingdom. And he says, verse 5, now I plead with you, lady, not as though I wrote a new commandment. So the lady here is the church, obviously, But that we had had from the beginning, that we love one another. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, and as you have heard from the beginning, you should walk in it. And so God's commandments that we are to walk in, that is something we can never forget and never turn away from. You know, we are in the time, if you look at the prophecies about the church and what's going to be happening in the time before Jesus Christ returns, it's somewhat sobering. We have the parable of the 10 virgins, where the entire church slumbers and goes to sleep. We have Daniel chapter 12 and verse 7, the power of the holy people is being scattered. We have some prophecies like the Laodicean era that basically tried in the fire. So we don't know exactly what will be happening. We cannot control the overall aspect of events. All we can do is each one of us make sure that we are holding fast and that we are not neglecting salvation. You know, the entire book of Hebrews is one you might review at some point. The book of Hebrews is written to a church kind of like ours. It's preparing for some great disasters. Who knows what could happen in the next few months or weeks? Who knows what could happen in the next years? But things are slowly falling together, not falling apart. They're coming together for the return of Jesus Christ. But the Hebrews, Paul wrote to them and said, not to neglect salvation. He said, there's a promise remaining of his rest, but have fear of God, lest you seem to come short of it. He said, lest you come dull of hearing. Almost every chapter, in fact, all but about 3 in Hebrews, contain some strong admonition, some warning about having need of endurance, needing to be strengthened, that never forget that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever, and is going to be there for us and will take care of us during these challenging times. And we have time. Let's go over to Zephaniah chapter 1. A book we don't look at too often, but Zephaniah, I think, has some application to the times in which we live. Very, very sad news about the children who were swept away from their summer camp at that flood in Texas. I don't have any personal connection with it except that my daughter called this morning from Seattle. She is an emergency room doctor at Puyallup Hospital, Good Sam, but she's part of an online club of women emergency room doctors who like to travel. So they share, in fact, most of our travel we did in UK and in Ireland were because these other ladies have recommended certain places to stay or certain guides of various things to do, so it really helped her a lot. But she saw 2 postings where 2 of the nurses in that organization lost 9-year-old daughters in that flood. And so she was kind of personally a little bit affected by it. And, you know, my wife and I 5 years ago lost my niece to fentanyl, and then her 2 little daughters suffocated to death in that car in Texas. And it has affected our family and certainly brought back a lot of bad memories of that, just to see the terror that happened this morning in Texas and bring back, you know, the horrible loss of little children, which simply cannot be, you know, you can't deal with it other than just to get through each day as best you can. So our hearts and prayers go out to them. But I think how it applies to us, perhaps, is to realize that that flood river, the Guadalupe River, according to what I heard this morning in Kerrville, rose 20 feet in 1 hour. And just downstream from that, I think it was Connor or Condon, I forget what the name of the town was, it rose 30 feet in 1 hour. So 6 inches per minute that river was rising. And the saddest picture I saw on the TV this morning was a little cabin, looked like a dorm building from a camp, going down, you know, they have little porches on them, going down the river, and there were 3 or 4 little girls looking out the window in terror at the person who was taking the video. And it's just heartbreaking. But it happens so quickly. It happens like a whirlwind. And Jesus Christ prophesied through Ezekiel and many of the prophets that the events that come in the end time are going to happen like a whirlwind. It's not going to be a lot of notice. It's going to be happening on them like they were never ready for it. So in Zephaniah chapter 1, let's begin in verse 12. It shall come to pass at that time I will search Jerusalem with lamps and punish the men who are settled in complacency and say in their heart, the Lord will not do good, nor will he do evil. In other words, God's not going to do anything. So he's going to punish the people who are settled in complacency. Now, how many of us are settled in complacency? How many are neglecting salvation? How many are neglecting prayer and Bible study and you know, faithful in tithing and faithful in doing all that we can to reflect Jesus Christ and what he taught us? If we are settled in complacency, God says, He is going to punish them. Down verse 14, the great day of the Lord is near. It is near and hastens quickly. The noise of the day of the Lord is bitter. There the mighty men shall cry out. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of desolation and devastation, a day of darkness and gloominess. That's coming on all the earth. A day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of trumpet and alarm against the fortified cities. Then he goes on to say that silver and gold will not be able to save us in those days. But down in chapter 2, he says, verse 3, I think this is the key verse for us in this section. Seek the Lord, all you meek of the earth, who have upheld his justice. Seek righteousness, seek humility. It may be that you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger. What does that sound like? Revelation 3, about the Philadelphian era being taken away from the punishment on the earth. It sounds like God says he will be hiding those who are honest, those who are faithful, those who seek righteousness with humility. He'll be hiding them from these terrible events that are to come on the earth. Well, I want to go over to Ecclesiastes. Chapter, I think it's chapter 11. Let me see here. Oh, Ecclesiastes chapter 12, the last chapter. It says, remember now your Creator in the days of your youth before the difficult days come. So prepare ahead of time before the difficult days. And the years draw near when you say, I have no pleasure in them. While the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are not darkened, the clouds don't return after the rain, and the day when the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men bow down. In other words, a time of great trouble and trauma coming on the earth. When the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look through the window grow dim. When the windows are shut in the streets, and the sound of grinding is low. So maybe he's really talking about the end of each individual life, but also some challenging times. And then down to verse 6, remember your Creator before the silver cord is loosed, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the wheel, and the dust will return to the earth as it was, obviously referring to the time of our physical death. And the spirit will return to the God who gave it. Vanity of vanity, says the preacher. All is vanity means perhaps some people have regret. Then he says in verse 11, the words of the wise are like goads, prods, and the words of scholars are well-driven nails given by one shepherd. And further, my son, be admonished by these. Of making books there's no end, and of much study is wearisome to the flesh. But let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is all of man's work. For unto God will bring every work in the judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. Now, in my 10 years here, I estimate I've given about 360 sermons. Bible studies, probably about 200, if you consider the Wednesday night Bible studies that we had for over 5 years. And you might not remember anything I've ever said. In fact, you might forget everything I've said today. But I want you to remember one thing. And the best way to remember something sometimes is to put it to song. So when I was at Ambassador College, one of my roommates one semester was a man named Mike Hale. He was from Peoria, Illinois. I actually met him before I went to college because he attended church, the next church circuit over. Some of you might remember Mike Hale as Big Beak. He used to get up in this silly chicken outfit and prance around for these movies. So one night Mike didn't come back to the booth. He was gone. And one of the guys asked him later, where'd you go last night, Mike? You didn't come back to sleep. Where'd you sleep at? He said, I had an idea for a song. So I went down to the piano booth. It was a separate booth there in Big Sandy where there was some pianos and some other instruments. And he said, I wrote this song out. And so he wrote this song out, and he did it. I think it was actually on one of the Ambassador College albums at one time. But Mike furnished me a copy of the music. So we will now have a musical end to the message. And just, if you don't remember anything else I've ever said for 10 years, don't forget the words of this song. Will that? Fear God and do His will. It's such a simple sounding thing to do, and still to do good and love fulfill. You need His helping hand today and always will. Love God the way you should. He knows the hidden things, the bad, the good. Fear God and do His will. It's all that matters now or ever will. Studying the ways of man is vanity. Of making books there is no end. There's a new tomorrow for you and me. The older life is passing with the wind. Fear God, He loves the man who lives abundantly right from His hand. Fear God and do His will. It's all that matters now or ever will. Remember your Creator now so earnestly, ere the silver cord of life is snapped in two, and the golden bowl is broken, and the mourners fill the streets, and the way of flesh is calling out for you. All is done, it's all been heard. Hear the conclusion now, the final word. Fear God and do His will. It's all that matters now or ever will. It's all that matters now or ever will. It's all that matters now or ever will.